Yeah. So I'm Simone Austin, and I'm an advanced sports dietitian and an accredited practicing dietitian. So I have worked for probably 25 years as a dietitian, and I started off in community health, but also simultaneously with an interest in sports nutrition. So pretty early on in my career, I started working part-time at the Western Bulldogs AFL team. And that was back when training was still after work and lots of players were still working part-time as well as playing. And then I continued working in community health and public health at the same time as sport, and spent 7 years later on at the Australian cricket team, men's cricket team, through pretty successful times of, Brett Lee, Glenn McGrath, Shane Warne, Adam Gilchrist, Steve Waugh times. So I was pretty lucky. And then moved on to work at Hawthorn AFL Football Club. So I've been there for 12 years. We've had 3 premierships in that time. And then during that as well, I was doing small consultancies to Melbourne Storm, Rugby League, Melbourne City, which is soccer. And 1 year I did the inaugural year at the Rebels Rugby Union. So, and then some consultancy to businesses, food companies like Rokeby Farms, Almond Board, a little bit to Olive Wellness Institute, and different places along the way. And I do a day a week health writing for Swiss Wellness. So, and I'm president at Sports Dietitians Australia and have been for 5 years, and I'm a media spokesperson for our Dietitians Association, and I've moved into the passion of public speaking now.
Yeah, that's awesome. Some pretty good achievements within there. So let's start it off with your book called Eat Like an Athlete, which I actually read about.
I forgot that. Yeah.
I read that about this time last year, and it was a great read. It was a real eye opener. So what was your inspiration for writing the book in the first place?
Yeah, I wanted to do more in the public speaking space, more that trying to spread nutrition message and accurate nutrition information to a greater audience. So my mentor at the time, who used to be the CEO at Swiss Wellness, Radek Saleh, said, well, if you want to do that, Simone, and you want to do more professional public speaking, you need to write a book. I thought, oh my, a book. I don't know if I'm even good at writing, but I thought, he's a smart man, I will write a book. So I did that and hope to really get people to not diet and get them to understand that nutrition is all about performance, even if you're not an athlete.
Right. Okay. And then what was your experience with like working with Hawthorn like? Because obviously, like you said, you won the 3 flags in the time you were there. I imagine that would have been a pretty awesome experience there.
Yeah, I think you look back on it and think, wow, that was good. And at the time, the first premiership was fantastic. And then the second one, you think, oh, wow, okay, is this really real? And then the next year, it's like, oh, well, you sort of nearly get a bit blasé and expect to be in a grand final, which was a bit crazy. But I think you particularly look back and then say, did that really happen? And the good thing about elite sport, even if you're not winning flags, is the upbeat environment that are always looking to achieve more. So even if you've won 3 flags, it's okay, how do we stay up there? What do we do next? So that's a really enjoyable part of working in elite sport.
Right. And yeah, I don't know if you'd be able to name players specifically, but in terms of like the players' nutrition, what were the players most fussy about when it came to eating certain things? And I don't know if you can name people.
Are you talking about at AFL
or
in
like
general?
At Hawthorn, yeah.
I think it's more about ones that come with different cooking skills. So I remember one year we had a bit of a MasterChef cook-off, and back then our first one of those, there was players like Brad Sewell and Max Bailey and Todd Crow, older players, and they were really they're competitive about everything. So to imagine having a cook-off, they were really competitive about their food. But they're all pretty good. Some of the favourites like favourite foods after a game are avocado and Vegemite on toast, and your likes of Luke Bruce and Liam Shields, Jack Gunston, they tend to like to have that after a game.
Right, awesome.
Back in cricket, Warney always liked to have very plain food, so he was very much ham and cheese toasties were up his alley.
Yeah, he loved that, and the ham and pineapple pizzas as well. Yes. He often liked, yeah.
On his last game, his last test match in Melbourne, I got the caterers at the MCG to make a Hawaiian pizza, and I gave that to him. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, so that was actually going to lead into my next question, which was what did post-match nutrition look like for players in terms of like, were they eating sort of higher GI foods or was it lower GI foods? And in terms of protein intake as well, what were they aiming for after games?
So after a game, particularly in AFL and rugby league, I found the players were exhausted. So if you know yourself or your listeners do exercise to the point where you're exhausted, it usually suppresses your appetite. So I'm wanting them to eat and drink and start preparing for, their next training session. It's got to be food for them that is really easy to get down. So it's not always the most ideal nutrition because it's something I just need to get them to eat. So we usually start with a milk drink that's higher in protein. And that can sometimes be a protein powder drink, but their favorite at the moment are the Rokabee's breakfast smoothies. So they tend to have those because it's easy. So it's liquid. They can get in some calories. They can get in some protein, and milk has got the perfect amount of electrolytes. So that's what they normally start with. Then it's food that they can hold in their hand and walk around with, because as much as nutrition is on top of the agenda for me, they've got physio to look at, they've got massages to have, they've got media wanting them, they've got coaches meetings. So they like souvlaki's often, so we'll get those, or a burger just with salad. I don't let them have the chips. Sometimes it might be a pasta dish that they can just hold in a tub and eat pretty easily. Fruit, pikelets, but stuff that's very easy to get down. Yeah, and as I said, toast with avocado and Vegemite is pretty popular as well.
Yeah, right. Okay. And then for endurance athletes, for example, what sort of diet and nutrition would you prescribe to them opposed to someone that's more into like bodybuilding, if we were to use that scenario?
I don't do a lot with bodybuilding. So more probably if we think about, I even think AFL is basically an endurance sport. So I tend to think of anything after 90 minutes is endurance. And when they're running 15 Ks and more, I like, it depends on the player. So if it's a player that I'm trying to get them to maintain their muscle mass or gain mass, it's very much about it getting the calories in after the game. But I also want quality. So I still talk to them about you're not to go through the drive-through necessarily and just get junk. I need you to be thinking about repair for your body. So again, liquid things go down well, whether it be, smoothies or stuff like that. But I want them to get in protein, around 30 grams of protein in that first meal or opportunity after a game. And I want them to get in some carbs to replace it as well. I'm not too fussed if they're high or low GI carbs, because they've got time, whether, they have it straight away and then follow up with a meal afterwards. They've got at least 24 hours. So as long as they're continuing to have more carbohydrates over the next 24 hours, it doesn't matter so much whether they're high or low GI. They're going to get digested and absorbed in that time anyway.
Okay.
As a bodybuilder, as I said, I don't have as much experience with that, but I would be thinking they might be a bit more careful with the total calories they're having. But they're often focused way too much on just getting protein in. They get too much protein in, and then that protein has to be broken down to be used for energy anyway, because you've got to first replace your energy before your body's going to maintain its muscle. So you should always be thinking of some carbs as well.
Right, because that was going to be one of my questions as well, because there's a lot of people out there that say in terms of bodybuilding, it's the 2 grams of protein per kilo of body weight is what you should be aiming for and that sort of thing. But then there's a lot of science coming out at the moment saying a diet that's higher than 20% in protein can actually be almost carcinogenic and almost lead to sort of cancer predispositions and things like that. So I don't know if you've ever looked into anything like this or what you would recommend in terms of a percentage of your total diet coming from protein.
Yeah, I think looking per kilogram body weight is okay, but you certainly don't want to go over the 2 grams. And you also should be looking at what type of training you're doing and when you're doing it as to which meal might need to be that much. So in general, for average population, I think 1 gram per kilogram body weight is plenty, and most of us actually achieve that. For athletes wanting to gain muscle, getting up to 1.5 grams and maybe up to 2 grams per kilogram body weight is fine. But I think if you look at lots of bodybuilders or some other people's diets, they're way over the 2 grams per kilogram body
100%.
weight. And that is my concern, because then they're missing out on other nutrients that are really important. And also that some of that protein might not be absorbed, and it might be going to your large intestines and being fermented by your bacteria there. And the substances that they're being fermented into may not be so good for us. So,
Right.
yeah, that's where you're probably talking about. I'm not going to say they're carcinogenic, but certainly too much protein might lead it to be malabsorbed, going to your large intestines, ferment it, and that those gases might not be so good for us.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And then in terms of like intra-game nutrition and that sort of thing, what are the players that are having at halftime and quarter time and that sort of
Yeah.
thing?
And I've worked on this in the last few years with some players, particularly who have gut upset during the game. And we're finding that if they haven't eaten for a few hours before the game, and if they're not eating during the game, time to get to the end of the game, it could be 4 or 5 hours or so since they've really had something to eat. And that can upset their gut because there's no blood flow going. So I think it is important to have something, and it could be just fruit. Often it might be for us oranges, mandarins, grapes, bananas, things like that. Others, they might have a handful of pretzels. It might be just little pikelets with jam, those sort of rice cracker type flavored biscuits, things like that that are pretty easy to eat and digest. And sometimes they're giving them a bit of salt as well to help with holding on to the fluid. So it doesn't have to be a lot, but when the game is going for that long, I think it is important to have something to eat during the game to keep the blood flow going to the gut.
Okay, and is there like a particular electrolyte drink that you prescribe to them as well?
So some of them will have water, some of them will have hydrolyte, some of them will have a sports drink like Gatorade or Powerade. So it really depends on the player as to what they prefer to have, and also whether they're really big sweaters or salty sweaters or not. And how much they're eating as well. So if they're having water, but they're eating some pretzels at the same time, then they're going to be getting sodium from that. If they're not eating as much, then we probably want them more to have some sports drink to get some carbohydrate as well as electrolytes at the same time.
Okay,
So it's quite individual.
Yeah, that makes sense. And what are your thoughts around the vegan diet? Because personally, I've heard a lot of conflicting evidence, especially recently, in terms of what's good, what's bad, and that sort of thing. So what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, my number one on that is I don't think we need to label ourselves necessarily with stuff. If you want to follow a vegan diet, fine. But I think be careful about if you're not sure about it, not falling into the trap of saying, oh, I must go vegan, because you don't have to label it. And if you start to label it, it means, say a day you might really feel like you want to have some fish or meat or chicken or dairy. If once you've labeled your diet, you put yourself into a pigeonhole of not being able to do that. And if it's for an ethical reason, then fine, I'm not going to make a judgment about that. If it's to do with your nutrition, which is what I'm qualified to talk about, I find that it can be quite restrictive and maybe unnecessarily restrictive in terms of nutrients. So for your health, a plant-based diet where it's a lot of plants, but then some dairy and some meat, there's no evidence to suggest that small amounts of those aren't bad for us. And it certainly makes it much easier for an AFL athlete or other athletes if they can have a wider range of food. If you're going to follow a vegan diet, you have to be very dedicated to making sure that you're getting the iron, the zinc, the B12, the protein that you need. You can do it, but you have to be quite dedicated to do that.
Okay, great. And this is a question from one of the listeners who is a vegan himself, and he wanted to know how much fruit is too much fruit?
Yeah, and that depends on what your energy needs are. So if you're someone who needs a lot of calories or kilojoules in your diet, and often people on a vegan diet, their diet is not as calorie dense, so they might need a bit more. The recommended servings per day are 2 servings per day for the average person. I find that athletes often need more than that just because they need more calories in their diet. So if that person is quite active, then they certainly be good having 3 or 4 serves a day. I don't think without knowing what their requirements are, whether I can put a limit on it. But what I suggest they do is if they're having more than, say, 4 pieces of fruit a day, then asking themselves, what are they missing out on? Should they be having a handful of nuts to make sure they're actually getting enough protein and fiber and good fats in their diet? Are they having a soy-based drink to get some, calcium fortified to get some milk? So more than 4 pieces a day, just be checking they're not missing out on something else because they're just having a lot of fruit.
Okay, awesome. And yes, sort of similar again for the ketogenic diet. What are your thoughts on keto?
Yeah, I think it should only, if you're really following it to the degree, you should only be using that for medical reasons, which is what it was developed for, which is more about epilepsy. A lot of people say they're following it and they're not actually following it.
They
It's
just eat the
very
foods that
hard.
say keto on it, don't they? Yeah.
Yep. And then they're still having way more carbs than really what a ketogenic diet is. I don't think it's a good diet. It's too restrictive to be following it to exact of what that's medical conditions of keto is. I think it's very important to get as many different foods in your diet as you can, and you should be trying to get at least 30 different plant foods in a week. You can't follow a ketogenic diet if you're doing that. So it's not my preferred thing because I find it's just too restrictive on nutrients that are really important to us, and a lot of plant-based things like fruit, which are and grains and legumes. In Australia, we have a big incidence of bowel cancer. If you're following a ketogenic diet, you're not getting all the dietary fiber and grains that we need. And so that would be my concern, is that you're going to increase your risk of bowel cancers.
Okay. And I guess something that's become a little bit more popular, or from what I've noticed anyway in the last 12 months, is the carnivore diet, which is including all the organ meats and things like that. What are your thoughts on this? Because obviously you're not going to be getting the fiber and stuff that you just spoke about in the last question, but there seems to be a lot of benefits for this to an extent for people with certain medical conditions too. So what are your thoughts on the carnivore diet?
Again, I come back to, why do people need to label themselves with things? Why do you have to say, I'm following a carnivore diet, I'm following a vegan diet, I'm following a whatever it is? Why can't you just have what you eat is your diet? It doesn't need a label. So if you want to increase some organ meats in your diet, then that's fine, and it's great in terms of not wasting things. You want to make some liver pate, you want to eat some brains. I can remember my mum frying up some brains and not telling me as a kid, breadcrumbing them. I don't have an issue with that, but I don't think it has to be at the expense of other foods. I think it can be added to a very well balanced, wide range of diets, and I don't think you need to label it. It's not a religion. You don't need to label yourself with that.
Awesome. And what foods at the moment would you recommend for people to consume more of or eat less of during COVID-19?
I definitely think legumes and lentils we should be eating more of, because they are shelf stable. Like you can have them in a can or you can have them dried. They're going to give us a lot of protein and good carbs, slow release carbohydrates, more fiber. So it's going to read our gut bacteria. Our gut holds 70% of our immune system.
Right.
So it's really important to be feeding those bacteria in there, which then produce the gases that then go into your bloodstream and signal your organs, including your immune system. The Mediterranean diet is the one style diet that has the most evidence of it to being great for our overall health, including our immune system. And legumes and lentils are key in there. And as Australians, we don't eat anywhere near enough legumes and lentils. So that would be my number one. My number two would be a handful of nuts a day, because I think they're a great snack and people are probably walking to their pantry and fridge a bit more often. So they will help fill you up a bit as well, and good healthy fats in there and some protein and fiber, again, to feed our gut bacteria. My third one is to use olive oil, extra virgin olive oil. I think that's really important. Oh, can I have one more? My fourth one.
Yeah.
If you walk into the supermarket, there's so much fresh produce there. What's everyone stocking up on all the other bits and pieces? We're allowed to go to the supermarket, stock up on the fresh stuff, help the farmers, number one. And number two, the fresh food is what we need to be eating plenty of. So, strawberries and bananas and apples and pears that are coming into season, and all the vegetables. Make yourself a good veggie-based soup with legumes and lentils in it, and have that for lunches during the day. So they're my things. Get some fresh legumes as well, nuts and extra virgin olive oil.
And would you recommend any vitamins or mineral supplements as well, like a zinc or something like that?
Yeah. Because I work at Swiss Wellness as a health professional, I'm not allowed, under our TGA law, as a health professional working for a company, I'm not allowed to make any comments on what supplements people should or shouldn't be taking.
Okay, fair enough. So what would you say are the staple foods that you would recommend for any diet?
Staple veggies. Number one are veggies. So anywhere between a third to half of your plate are vegetables. And I think always making sure you get in some green veggies. So green leafy ones, whether that be, lots of the different lettuces, whether it be cabbage, broccoli, silver beets, spinach, and they're really easy to grow at home. Get yourself some spinach or some silver beet. Grow it in a pot even. When it's baby, you can pick off the baby leaves and use it as a salad. And if not, you can then add it to your stir fry, your lasagna, whatever you like. So green leafies for sure. They definitely a staple. You've got to get and then some orange. So if you can get some orange or red in and some green, then you're going to be getting heaps of your vitamins and minerals and antioxidants in. Doesn't have to be hard.
What about the greens and reds powders that go around? Do you think they have any value?
You've got to read the labels to make sure how much of it is actually the vegetable and how much it is a filler, which is usually a carbohydrate like a maltodextrin. So I think you're always best to use either fresh veggies or frozen, and frozen is snap frozen, and then third canned before I would be using a powder.
Yeah, okay. And what would you say is the biggest issue with most people's diets that you see at the moment?
And it doesn't matter whether it be an old, young, athlete, not athlete. It comes back to, again, Australians not eating enough vegetables. I think 93% of Australians in the 2012, which is our latest big national health survey, 93% of us didn't eat the 5 serves of veggies a day. So it's about thinking about not just dinner time to get into your veggies, but how do I get some in at breakfast? Tomatoes, mushrooms, spinach, baked beans, chickpeas, whatever. Snacks, nuts, fruit, but then cutting up some carrots or cherry tomatoes or avocado to go with it. And then having something in your lunch, whether it be a veggie soup or salad in your wrap or your sandwich, and then some in at dinner time. That's our biggest downfall, along with not eating enough whole grains. Too much processed grains, white rices, white breads, white crackers. It's okay to have some of them, but we need more grains and more legumes.
Okay, awesome. And another question I have from one of the listeners, he's an athlete, he's a cricketer, and he wants to know, how do you know if you're eating enough food?
Easiest way, 2 ways. One is how your energy intake is. So do you actually feel like you've got enough energy to do your training or to play his game of cricket? And if not, then that would be the first thing he'd look at, his fluid, and then he would look at his food and the timing of his food. Is he having enough before the game, before training, after training, and during the week, so his stores are full to train each time and to play? The other one is looking at his body weight. So if you're not eating enough food, you'll start to lose muscle mass and you'll start to lose body fats as well. So if he's got access to scales occasionally or skin fold measurements or something like that. So energy levels and then also your body composition will tell you whether you're having enough to eat or not.
Okay, great. Now, before I get into the final 2 questions, where can people access all of your content?
So on my website, so simoneaustin.com.au, so they'll get some regular blogs and information about me on there. Obviously the book, which you just, bookstores, just Google it and, Booktopia or your favorite bookstore. And maybe it's a good time to support, online bookstores and getting that in either hard copy delivered or you can get it in electronic copy. So Eat Like an Athlete. Also Instagram, so I try and do really practical tips of just things my family eat, recipes we do. So that's Simone_Austin. Same shares to Facebook, so my page is Simone Austin Dietitian. The same sort of stuff shares to Twitter, but I don't do too much Twitter. And I'm about to set up putting some of my videos onto a YouTube channel. So hopefully that will be, I'm going to commission my daughter to do that. So that should be it. Hopefully that will be, that'll be up soon as well. But Instagram, I usually have links to everything as well and my website. You can message me questions.
Yeah, well, I'll chuck the links to those in the show notes. So the first of the last 2 questions is a little bit of a sort of hypothetical situation. So I want you to imagine that you're speaking to the whole world, basically. So everyone in the whole world is listening to you speak at this one time, and you could only give them 3 pieces of advice. What would they be?
My first piece of advice, and you're going to think I sound like a broken record, is to plan your meals around your vegetables rather than planning them around your meat. So rather than saying chickens for dinner, plan it around your veggies and then add your protein. That'd be my first piece of advice. My second piece of advice is to learn some basic cooking skills. Because if you can't cook a little bit, you can't prepare your food. So don't have to be a gourmet chef, but learn from your mum, your aunt, your brother, your sister, whoever can cook or read. Most of us have got access to being able to read, follow a recipe, and get 2 or 3 recipes under your belt. So that's important. And the third one is to not feel guilty about your food. You don't have to cut foods out forever. All foods can have a place. And if the more you feel guilty about it, the more you're going to want to eat those foods. So allow yourself to eat the foods, but try and surround yourself with the healthy choices because they'll make them the easy choices.
Awesome. Great answer. So lastly, this podcast is all about the processes and how to become state of the art. So in your opinion, what does it mean to be state of the art?
What does it mean to be state of the art? For me personally, or for people with their diet?
Or for you personally, I'd say, yeah.
For me personally, it is to continue to have something in my work that is a challenge. So it's got to be something new in there. And so it was writing the book was a big challenge. Then it's how do I perfect myself to be a really good presenter? And that's what I'm working on at the moment. And through my new job in advocacy. So it's not to become stale. There should be always one key part of your work that is new or that you're learning and developing about.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks, Tom. I hope your listeners get something out of it, and I'd love to hear from them and see what they cook. Share it with me.